Hi, everybody. This is Dustin with Utah News here. It is Tuesday, January 14th. Glad to see you here today. I hope you're doing well. If you got a chance, Pete Hegseth's Senate hearing was this morning for his confirmation, which was really exciting to watch. I don't know if you're into that, but if you're not, you should go take a look. Some of the comments were great to hear. Some was a little entertaining, but that was on this morning, and we have 6 days until the inauguration is supposed to be coming up. So a little bit of a busy week overall. Now, we did post up a quick short yesterday in regards to two decisions that were made. One was actually just something that happened here locally in Utah. The other was a Supreme Court case. And that one was in regards to hearing the Utah public lands case that was sent up to the Supreme Court. So it's not necessarily that they were going to hear it directly. It was their decision to hear the case. Now, that was turned away, and they decided that on that, it does not rule that they cannot refile in lower courts. However, in the article, it does go on to say that Democrats and conservation groups celebrated Monday's decision, emphasizing the importance of federal land management for public benefit. Okay, well, some of our Republican leaders that were in office and had something to say, including Spencer Cox, Stuart Adams, House Speaker Schultz, Hooper, Attorney General Derek Brown, said they're disappointed with the decision not to hear the case. They did cite that it wasn't immediately clear if the state would refile in lower court, but they did note that Monday it was ambiguous enough and it did not mention anything about constitutional arguments or anything that prevents the state from filing in federal district court. So they added that they are able and willing to challenge federal land decisions that harm Utah, but they believe that some of the concerns might be resolved with the upcoming Trump administration. So we'll see where this goes. Now, meanwhile, on the other side, Democrats celebrated the decision after arguing that the federal government has the responsibility to manage the lands for the public while the state's case was being considered. They do go on to say that this decision is a win for Americans and the protection of our environment. Now, that was said by the leader, Angelo Romero. And today's actions serve as an important reminder that our public lands should not be privatized or exploited for short term benefits. Now, the article goes on to cite a few other quotes and some other details in regards to this. One of the base concerns, and we're going to touch on some of our points that we've gathered through this case, is basically that it's pretty catastrophic, honestly. We don't own 70% of the land in Utah. Okay. So that goes on to a little bit more of the issues we have covered before. There have been some other great podcasters that have as well. There's one about smart growth with Randall O'Toole. I want to look into that a little bit deeper, covers a lot of these initiatives that have been going on. So now the fact that Utah doesn't own 70% of its land, it is actually owned by federal government. It's really concerning, particularly among Utah state officials and some residents. Now, the situation has led to tensions between state federal authorities, culminating in that lawsuit that we just discussed here that was filed in August of 2024. So, to continue into some of our points, Utah officials argue that federal control over such a vast portion of the state's territory significantly diminishes Utah's sovereignty compared to other states. We'll go into a little bit about that, a little later in this podcast here, just because it's really impressive to see the difference on ownership rates in the different states. Some of the key points here is that they contend this level of federal ownership prevents the state from exercising full legislative authority over land use, collecting taxes, and using eminent domain for infrastructure development. Now, eminent domain, if you're aware of the term, it's actually happened to some owners near me for some developments that have happened, basically where they deem it, they're just going to assume the land, maybe force you off of it, depending what that might be. There's a lot more that goes into it, so don't hold me to just that. But it's a pretty scary use of land. There are some key points we'll dive into here real quick. Economic impact overall, land management practices, constitutional arguments, comparative disadvantage, and then public access and use. And that one's a big one for all of us, being that we're here in Utah. Most everyone here that I know is an outdoors person, whether it's just going up to paddleboard or kayak or go for a hike, rock climb. It affects all of us on these lands. So first and foremost is the economic impact. And now these concerns that federal control limits Utah's ability, now again, our local ability, would impede us to generate revenue, through taxation and development initiatives, manage natural resources for our economic benefit, and develop essential infrastructure like public highways and communication networks. Okay. Now, on the land management practices, now these are again the critics of the federal management that argue local governance would be more effective and responsive to state needs. Ideally, I would agree. I mean, that's a local official making decisions about our local land. They live here, they get some feedback from the local community on what it should be used for. So it makes a little bit more sense to have it a locally owned land. Federal policies may restrict access and limit multiple use activities. Okay. Now, another big one here that was important to us was BLM lands are becoming less public due to federal actions from DC. And I would agree. That affects a lot of us too on the outdoors station as well. And you go camping in general, a lot of the lands we go on that don't necessarily have a lot of the amenities are typically BLM land. So keep that in mind. Some of the constitutional arguments is that the Utah's lawsuit challenges the constitutionality of long-term federal land ownership. This is arguing overall that the Constitution never intended a federal agency to hold on to so much land in any state, not just Utah. Also, the federal government's retention of those lands violates principles and federalism and state sovereignty, which I agree. We're owned by DC. We can't really enact our own local policies, which every state in the nation is a sovereign state, right? Or it should be. Comparative disadvantage. Now, officials point out the stark contrast with eastern states, and this is where we go into the land ownership differences. Federal land ownership is really minimal in a few of these. Now, for instance, federal government owns, and here we go, Connecticut, New York, and Rhode Island, okay? They own 1% of the land in those states. Whereas we look at others like Delaware, Maine, Massachusetts, Ohio, Pennsylvania, they own 3% of the land. Now, why the big interest in 70% of the land in Utah? Really urge you to look into that. So the disparity, they argue, puts Utah at a high disadvantage compared to other states in the union, which I would agree. And public access and use. So on this one, supporters of that federal management argue that it protects public lands for conservation and recreational purposes. And the critics contend in general that federal control may limit public access and use of these lands, that state management could better balance recreation, conservation, and responsible resource development overall. Which way do you side on that? I could see both points as far as just saying right there. But in general, federal control over our own resources here locally, again, they're not here. What's the initiative for them to be owning our land versus us developing and using our own Utah lands? Now, these concerns reflect a long-standing debate, and I urge you, please comment below. We'd love to have your opinions. Now, this goes into land management in the general Western United States overall. Goes in a lot of the relationship between state sovereignty, economic interest, federal authority over public lands. The big part, though, it's 70% of our land we don't own. It's the federal government. And there's a few other local podcasters that go into it as well. I'll cite them here. They're down in southern Utah that have gone into a little bit more of our local officials and how that land is used, how it gets sold off, some of the restrictions in regard to that. But that's a big deal. 70% of our land is not Utah's land. I, for one, don't want to go hiking and have to pay $20 every time I go up there. Same with kayaking or paddleboarding. Walk your dog in Mill Creek, you might have to pay a fee here coming up soon. A lot of these are concerning, but we definitely would like to hear your feedback. Put your comments below, and we can discuss it in more detail. I wanted to go into the second part of this. It is a little bit more serious, at least I think personally, because how bizarre it is. And I hope you take note and agree with me, at least in some points. Obviously, do your own research, look into it, and let us know what you think. So as part of our short yesterday, we sent out a couple notices in regards to the Supreme Court case for the Utah lands. This one goes along with it, and it is in regard to the new law enforcement division that just came out. Now, of course, there's an article on KSL you can look into. 140 officers sworn into Utah's newest law enforcement division. Now, with this new division of law enforcement, the basic idea of it is to consolidate 4 existing agencies into one. And the hope of it, of course, is to try and enhance the efficiency of these departments, coordinating the protection of our outdoor spaces. That's a little bizarre. And we already have some of these we'll get into in just a moment, but consolidating them under one, it reminds me of when all of Salt Lake County, you remember, had a unified police department, kind of merged the suburbs of West Jordan, West Valley, Murray, Holiday, Cottonwood, Salt Lake City into one police department called Unified PD. And obviously that wasn't as successful as people thought. So not too long ago, some of those sections were split apart again. Now we have separate police departments in, say, Taylorsville from Unified. Not to say they're not still around, but some are separating away. Now with this, the new formation, it's 140 different officers. They were sworn into this division on Monday this week, so January 13th, 2025. Now, it actually came into effect January 1st of this year on New Year's. This was following the approval of a bill, HB 469, by Utah lawmakers last year. On the consolidation piece that I wanted to touch on is the four divisions. And anybody that's been in Utah is aware of these divisions. So it combines four previous agencies of the Utah Division of Wildlife, Utah Division of State Parks, Utah Division of Outdoor Recreation, and the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Now, all of them are going to be managed under what's going to be called now the Utah Department of Natural Resources. Some of the purposes and benefits of it are that it's going to be improving communication and the coordinations between the agencies, enhancing efficiency in policing state and natural resources. That's a little suspicious to me. Now, providing more flexibility and responding to various law enforcement needs. Fair. And freeing up administrators to focus on planning and management of state parks and other facilities. Now, the scope of that responsibility, this one is a little fetched here. Now, each officer that was just sworn in is responsible for protecting wildlife, the lands, trails, and other resources across an average area 385,000 square acres. Now, that's roughly 5 times the size of Salt Lake City itself. That's a massive amount of area for one officer to manage. Now, one of the concerns is definitely potential for overreach. As I mentioned prior, there's 4 divisions that are already in charge of this. Anybody that's gone camping or hiking, fishing, you see your park rangers, Natural Wildlife Reserve. They're out there all the time checking. Now, we don't see them that frequently, sure, but they're there. Now, the potential for overreach, the concerns on that consolidation, it's too much power for one division to handle is the concern, especially over the vast area of the land. And now that each officer has 385,000 square acres to manage, it's a lot for one officer to handle. So you could see either a lot slipping through the cracks or potential for overreaching, because how are they going to really manage that? The accountability issues obviously are huge. So this would be a concern. Critics do argue that consolidating agencies might make it more difficult to hold the officers themselves accountable for misconduct. Critics express concern that the consolidation might lead to a little bit more of a militarized or detached approach to law enforcement. Again, to me, this personally relates to the land management issues we have in general, with 70% of it going federally. Now there's a new police going in to manage those lands when we had them previously. Now, there are a few links that, if you do some more research into this, that do relate heavily. I would definitely like to look into it a bit more here, and I urge you to do the same. Please comment, post below. We'd love to hear your feedback. Love to hear your interest on other topics we'd love to cover or you would love us to cover. And we'll see you again.